Hello viewers, the topic of today's program is population. Crowded buses and streets, overcrowded trains, long queues, mushrooming shanty towns, all these are supposed to be the manifestation of an alarmingly large population. But what is exactly the dimension of the problem? Is it the number per se that is a problem, or the resulting problems that it specifically causes that we should turn our attention to? What are policymakers doing about it in terms of not only forming a policy but implementing programs? All these form part of the discussion. To highlight these issues, we have with us in the studio today Dr. Kumud Pore, an eminent economist and formerly a senior professor at the Gowley Institute of Politics and Economics, Pune. This program will be divided into two parts. The first, which forms the topic of today's discussion, is population, status and problems. In the next session, we will take up population, policies and issues. Dr. Pore.
Yes.
It is said that the world faces an alarmingly large population question, and the problems that will come out of it will be so severe that they have to be attended to right now. Is this true?
Yes, to a large extent it is true, because if you take a historical perspective, you will find that at the beginning of the Christian era, we were just 250 million in the whole world. But later on, the population is rising more rapidly. For example, it took 1800 years to have the population growing from 250 million to 900 million. But it is growing faster and doubling in shorter and shorter periods, so that today we are having 5,300 million people in the world. It is true that we are also developing at the same time.
Yes, I was going to ask you that, because people do say that while there is a population increase, is it not also a fact that over the last 200 years, the world as a whole has been developing enormously, so that it is said that the world is richer today than it ever was? Then why should there be a problem?
Well, on the face of it, we feel that the world is growing richer, looking at the technological advancement and the levels of living that are rising in richer countries. But if you see the distribution of this population between the developed countries and the less developed countries, you will find that in 1990, 22% of the world population was living in the developed countries, and 77% of the world population was living in the developing countries. And it is projected that in the year 2025, actually only 16% will be living in the developed countries, and 83% of the population will be living in the developing countries, that is the poor countries. So, if the world is growing richer, it is growing richer only in the rich countries, and world as a whole is growing poorer, in the sense that more people are becoming poorer and not rich.
That is an alarming difference. Now,
Yes.
what is the reason for this large hiatus?
Well, there is a theoretical explanation for it, that every economy undergoes what is called demographic transition, and demographic transition is the stages through which the population growth goes throughout the period of development. In the initial period of development, naturally we are handling more carefully the death and disease in the economy, and therefore the death rates fall much faster than the birth rates.
That is demographic transition.
That is demographic transition. So, in the first phase, when everybody is poor and there is not much of economic development, not much effort also for economic development, the death rates are high and the birth rates are also high, and therefore, the natural rate of survival is low. But when the economic planning begins and deliberate efforts are made for development of an economy, the death rates fall much faster than the birth rates. And in this second stage of demographic transition, you find that the natural rate of survival increases rapidly, and you have the impact of accelerated rate of growth in population. But gradually it is expected that the birth rates will also fall and will be commensurate with the falling death rate.
So that it evens
and
out later.
It evens out at a later stage, which is the third stage of demographic transition. And all economies, mind you, are undergoing the demographic transition. Even the now developed economies did have the demographic transition. But for them, the question was that the medical knowledge was developing gradually and the death rate was also falling gradually. But the developing countries are getting all the advantage of accumulated medical technology, and naturally the death rate is falling much faster.
Of particular concern to us, is India also in this stage of demographic transition, and at what point of the transition is it?
Well, in the case of Indian economy, you will find that Indian population is also growing at an accelerated rate, particularly after 1951. And when we became independent, and as all the developing countries were, we were also extremely poor, and poverty, disease resulting in malnutrition, undernourishment resulted in high rates of infant mortality, premature death, and therefore, the first issue was really fighting poverty and fighting disease. Now, most of the developing countries are still fighting poverty and not very successful at it, but disease they have been fighting successfully. For example, in India, we have effectively controlled epidemics like plague and cholera, to a certain extent malaria also in the beginning of the plague period when the DDT was very effective, and therefore, the death rates are falling. Now, if you see the growth of Indian population from 1911 to 1901, you can say, to 1991, in all these censuses, you will find that the population is growing much faster after 1951. In 1951, for example, the rate of growth was only 13% over the decade, and in 1961 it became 21%, in 71 it became 24%, and now in 1991 it is again 23.6%. So, India is also undergoing this stage of demographic transition. If you look at the birth rates and the death rates during this period, you will see that between the 1911-20 decade, the birth rate was 48 per 1000 per year. The death rate was also 48, around the same. So, that almost there was no growth in the total population. But if you come to 1951-60 decade, in that period the birth rate has not fallen much, it has fallen to only 41.7, but the death rate has fallen to 28.8, and in the latest decade 81 to 90, the birth rate is again 32, not much fall, but the death rate has fallen to 11.4. But the hope is that we will soon be entering the third phase of demographic transition, because in the last decade, marginally at least, the rate of natural survival is declining.
So, we can hope for a happier future at the rate in terms of the demographic transition.
Yes.
Within India itself, the overall figures are still remain large, but is there a difference within states? We have so many and each one is supposed to be progressing at its different pace. So, do we see a manifest difference in the demographic transition in some states as compared to others?
Certainly. As far as death rates are concerned, death rates are affected by the extension of medical facilities, availability of medical technology, and death rates therefore are more or less uniformly falling in all the states. About the birth rates, the problem is that birth rates are determined by a variety of factors, and all these factors are not uniformly growing or progressing in the different states. For example, I will give you only selective figures. In Maharashtra, the birth rate is 27 and the death rate is 9.3. In Tamil Nadu, birth rate is 21 and the death rate is 9.2. In Kerala, you will be surprised, the birth rate is only 17.5 and the death rate is only 6. But unfortunately for Indians and India, the more populous states are not showing the same results. For example, Bihar, the death rate is 11.4, reasonably low, but the birth rate is 33. In Madhya Pradesh, the death rate is 13.9, reasonably low you can say, as compared to the 27% we had before, but the birth rate is still 35.9, and in UP the death rate is 13.7, but the birth rate is still 38, and these are the more populous states in the country, and that is why on an average also you will find that our transition into the third phase of demographic transition is going to be rather slow and much less speedily than desired, certainly much less speedily than expected.
Overall, numbers is one thing, which as you have already highlighted remained large, very large in some states and smaller in others, but the drag continues. But it is said that it is not the numbers per se, population per se, but rather the specific kind of problems that populations cause in terms of their composition, etc. Could you highlight what this means?
Well, there are two types of problems for an expanding population, and these can be divided into two types. One is structural problems and the second is macro problems. The structural problems in the expanding population, number one problem is that the child population increases in proportion. As you know, if you want to take it lighter vein, people die at different ages, but everybody is born at age 0. So that when the population is expanding very rapidly, the proportion of child population increases. So also when the life expectancy is increasing, the older people also are larger in numbers and their proportion also increases. Now this structure causes a problem because people between 15 and 59 are supposed to be economically active population, and children below 15 and old people above 60 are dependent on this economically active population. If their proportion goes on increasing, then there is a problem of a higher dependency ratio in the economy. More larger populations are dependent on the economically active population. That is number one. Secondly, if the child population is increasing, you also have to have larger expenditure in education, health, immunization, and extending these facilities to the entire child population. So also you may have problems of social security for the old people. So structure does create problems, and the children of tomorrow, children of today, I mean to say, are laborers of tomorrow, and therefore it also creates problem in the future for employment. And if the employment is not generated in adequate numbers, then you have increase in unemployment. If the potential workers do not get some work for their hands, then the problem of poverty is intensified. So structurally, the age composition creates these problems. There are other problems also which are structural problems, you can say, and these are the problems of concentration of population. You see, even in India, the urban population was much smaller when we became independent, but now it is growing at a higher rate, and unemployment in the rural areas creates a lot of migration to the urban areas. They say that urbanization is an indicator of economic development, then why should we be worried about it? But the unplanned and rapid expansion of urban population creates problems that are both economic as well as sociological. You see, large numbers coming into the cities without jobs or without assurance of jobs, only in the hope of getting a job, without any housing facilities to stay, and you find that people live in unnatural conditions, leaving their children and families back in the rural areas and coming alone for work in the urban areas. That is a very unnatural way of living. So also,
you mean a mass movement from the villages to the city is not necessarily the only an indicator of development or growth per se, or that they are having happier times here?
they may be having happier times only in comparison with what they had there, but they are not in absolute terms happy times at all for them.
The migration itself is caused by a kind of problem
Yes,
that
there
is
is a
back
push.
at home.
There is a push from the villages to the urban areas, and there is also, you can say, a temptation of the urban areas, a sort of magnetic pull of the cities,
Yes.
which brings them there in the hope of getting something. You see, however, this causes problems because, you know, the work distance between the workplace and the place of residence increases. So, lot of time and energy is spent in just going from residence to workplace.
It creates its
It
own
creates
problems.
its own problems.
Yes.
Also, you will find that because there is no housing facility, the plethora of juggi jhopdi increases in the urban areas.
Right, right.
And what is more is, because of the concentration of the population, the problems of pollution, the problems of disposal of solid waste in the urban areas are also high.
An endless change of problems
Yes.
therefore begins as
Yeah.
a result.
Let me highlight only one more problem, which is sociological, and that is, if people do not get work for their hands and if they are not having any gainful employment, it is very likely that they enter the underworld, and you can see the increase in crime and the increase in vice in mostly in the urban areas. That is because of the unplanned expansion of cities.
Thank you, Dr. Pore. You have concluded by highlighting a very important sociological problem that is resulting.
But there are also macro problems.
What are these?
Yes, the macro problem is, you will see everybody says that we are also developing, then why should there be a problem at all? But at the macro level, you will find that 1951 to 1991, national income has been fivefold, but the per capita income is only little over twofold. That is because the population has increased 2.5 times. So that at the macro level, you will find that per capita income does not increase as fast as the national income.
So that within the country
yeah,
itself,
yeah,
the country is richer, but the people still remain poor.
people are still poor, and India ranks 89th in the list of 109 nations only in per capita income, and 121st in the list of 160 nations on the criteria of human development and quality of life. What is more is that although we would like to do a lot for economic development, maintaining a rapidly rising population even at the given levels of consumption means that more resources have to be spent for consumption and less is available for investment and growth. So that there are macro problems as well as structural problems, and all these problems have to be tackled through better policies, both on the front of population as well as on the front of economic development.
Thank you. Well, viewers, I am sure you will agree this has been a most enlightening discussion, and the figures that Dr. Pore has provided to us give us an idea of not only the dimension of the problem, but its selective breakups in different parts. Having seen this, we decide the question that immediately confronts us is, if there are so many problems, if the dimension is known, if 25-30 years from now the developing world is going to have more than 4 times the number of people than the developed world, if there is going to be much greater urbanization but at the cost of the people, then what are we doing about it? What have policy makers in India decided to do? Have they been doing something? If so, how has it translated into programs? This forms the topic of our discussion next time on population. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pore.